Today, we're going to crack open one of the most talked about books on media analysis ever written, Manufacturing Consent. Our goal here is pretty simple. We're going to unpack its core theory, what's known as the propaganda model, and we'll use the book's own framework and examples to see just how it's supposed to work. Let's get right into it.
So, the book starts with this really fascinating puzzle. Think about it. In a society where the press is technically free, no official government censors telling journalists what they can and can't say, how does the news that gets to us still so often seem to line up with the interests of the powerful? It's a huge question, and it's the one we're going to explore.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at that central question about the media. Then we'll introduce the propaganda model itself and dive deep into what the authors call the 5 filters. After that, we'll check out a key case study, see how the model suggests the media sets the terms of debate, and wrap up with what this all might mean for us as people who consume the news.
Right, so let's really lock in on this central paradox. The book isn't talking about places with state-run TV stations. It's specifically analyzing a system where the press is private and, at least on paper, totally free. So, if that's the case, how does this consistent pattern of coverage seem to emerge?
And this quote from the book just nails it. You know, in a state-controlled system, the bias is right there on your face. It's obvious. But the authors argue that in a private system, the forces shaping the news are way more subtle. They're more structural. And because of that, they're a lot harder to even notice. It's not some government memo telling people what to say. It's about how the entire system is put together.
So, to try and answer that big question, the authors came up with a theory. They call it the propaganda model. And it's basically a framework to help us understand these subtle structural forces they're talking about.
Let's look at the actual definition here. The key idea is that raw information, all this stuff happening out in the world, doesn't just magically become the news. The book argues that it first has to pass through a series of 5 distinct filters. And these filters, according to the model, aren't random. They systematically weed out certain kinds of stories and points of view while pushing others to the front.
Now, this is a really important point to get. The authors are very clear that this model is about how the media performs, what kind of content gets produced, and how it gets framed. This is not a theory about media effects. It doesn't claim that we, the audience, are just passively soaking this stuff up and believing all of it. It's an analysis of the media industry itself.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of it. What are these 5 filters that the model claims are shaping everything we read and watch?
Here they are: ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack, and ideology. The book's argument is that these 5 forces all work together to create a powerful, though often invisible, system of control. So let's break them down one by one, starting at the top with ownership. So the first filter is about the sheer size and concentration of media ownership. Major news outlets are huge corporations, and as the source material points out, this concentration has been accelerating. When this analysis was first done in 1983, about 50 firms dominated the media. Just 7 years later, that number had been shopped to 23. When you have giant, for-profit corporations running the show, the model suggests that the ultimate bottom line is going to naturally favor stories that are friendly to corporate interests.
The second filter is advertising. Most of the media we consume relies on ad money to stay afloat. And what that really means is that the primary product isn't the news being sold to you, it's you, the audience, being sold to advertisers. This can create a ton of pressure to avoid stories that might tick off advertisers or that just appear in a context they don't like.
Okay, filter number 3 is sourcing. Journalism is a tough, fast-paced business. To keep the news cycle going, journalists need a steady, reliable flow of information. So where do they turn? Often to official sources: government press briefings, corporate PR offices, and think tank experts. These sources are seen as credible, and they can pump out a ton of information, but they also represent powerful interests. And, well, they have their own agendas to push. The fourth filter is flack. Basically, this is negative feedback. When a news outlet publishes a story that really challenges a powerful interest, they can expect to get hit with a storm of flack. We're talking complaints, lawsuits, advertiser boycotts, maybe even political pressure. This acts as a kind of discipline, It makes outlets think twice before they decide to run similar stories in the future.
And the fifth and final filter is ideology. When the book was written, the big one was anti-communism. It was this powerful national idea that could be used to frame almost any debate. The concept is that a dominant ideology, often based on the fear of a common enemy, can create a shared consensus that makes it incredibly difficult to challenge the basic assumptions behind a story or a government policy.
So this is the crucial point. And the authors really hammer this home. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's a description of a system. This quote says it all, really. It shows that journalists can be working with total integrity and doing their best, but because these filters are so baked into the structure of the media, the end result is systemic. Thinking of other ways to choose the news becomes almost unimaginable.
Now, how do the authors actually test this model? One of their most famous methods is to compare media coverage of very similar events. They look at what they call worthy victims and unworthy victims. This table is a really stark example from the source material. It tracks how many times the word genocide was used in the media in the 1990s. For atrocities committed by an official enemy, like the Serbs in Kosovo, the word was used 220 times. But for atrocities committed by U.S. allies, like Indonesia in East Timor or Turkey against the Kurds, the term was used way, way less. The suggestion here is that victims of our enemies are worthy of coverage, while victims of our friends, they're unworthy.
And this difference isn't just about how many stories there are. It's about the quality of the coverage, right down to the grammar. For enemy atrocities, the media tends to use the active voice, which clearly tells you who did the killing. Pol Pot slaughtered millions. But for atrocities committed by friendly states, like the massacres in Indonesia, the passive voice often creeps in. Suddenly, the person responsible vanishes. It wasn't Suharto slaughtered, it's that massacres occurred. It's a subtle but really powerful difference. The model doesn't just suggest the media filters out individual stories. It argues that, over time, it sets the entire agenda. It defines the very limits of what's even considered a reasonable topic for public discussion.
Let's look at the debate over the defense budget. The source material points out that polls consistently show the public wants less military spending and more social spending. But because powerful corporate and political interests want a large defense budget, the mainstream media debate is almost always limited to how much we should increase it. The option that the public actually seems to favor, to cut it, is pushed to the sidelines and treated as if it's not even a serious idea.
And here's another fascinating data point. The chemical industry often tries to dismiss the work of its critics by calling it junk science. Well, this chart shows how the media kind of internalized that framing. Between 96 and 98, that phrase was used 160 times to talk about environmentalists and corporate critics, but only 21 times to talk about corporate science itself. The media, in effect, started using the industry's own language.
So, after going through the theory and some of the evidence presented in the book, what should we really take away from all this?
The most important takeaway is what the model is and what it isn't. It is not a conspiracy theory about reporters getting secret instructions in a back room. It's a structural analysis. It argues that the combination of a profit motive, concentrated ownership, a reliance on advertising, and all these other systemic pressures, they naturally produce outcomes that tend to favor the interests of wealth and power.
And that leaves us with one final question. The propaganda model isn't meant to be the final answer on everything, but it is a tool for critical thinking. It offers a different lens for looking at the news. So the real question is, how might a framework like this, whether you end up agreeing with all of it or not, change the way you engage with the information you see every day?